morning, everybody. I'm just going to do a little bit of an introduction, just as we continue to admit people. As I said, there's a number of people, I think it's about 170 that have registered for today, so we're just admitting them. So just an introduction. I see that there's quite a few people that I know and I've worked with. So welcome back to another webinar. But just for those of you who don't know me, my name is Nikki Hardwick. I head up the HR division for HR Talk. And I'll be doing the webinar this morning on the Employment Equity Act and the changes that have come through. So this webinar will be slightly different to those that I've done in the past relating to employment equity. The purpose of today is to understand, sort of the strategic measures that we need to be putting in place, how the amendments are going to impact business, and sort of what is the expectation of you within business in relation to employment equity. I know that there's been quite a lot of talk, and I've heard a number of people who Sorry, can everybody hear me? I see one person has said there's no sound. Just as a thumbs up, is everybody else okay with sound? Okay, perfect. Okay, Bridget, you can hear me. Okay. Everybody can hear me. Okay. All right. So if you're unable to hear, okay, there we go. All right. So, and can everyone see the slides just before I continue? So everyone can see the slides and everyone can hear me. Perfect. Okay. Thanks, guys. All right, so as we go through the webinar, you're more than welcome to post any questions in the chat and I'll answer them as we go through. Those of you who've attended my webinars before, I like it to be fairly interactive. So if you have any questions, I'm very happy to answer them as we go. Alternatively, I'll wait till the end. So as I was saying before, there's a lot of uneasiness surrounding the changes which have actually been coming into effect for a number of years now. Initially it was supposed to be, I think, in COVID, then it didn't happen, and then it was supposed to be the year later. And so they've finally come into effect now. So how does that affect the business? I think historically, I've been working with employment equity since 2000. And so it was very shortly after the Act actually came into effect. And so I've worked with it as it's gone through the various changes. From my side, I would suggest that, historically, people have generally treated equity, as a sort of box ticking exercise. Even if we've had the committee and that kind of thing, the thing that has generally been missing is the actual implementation of equity within the business. And I'll talk more about strategic measures that, I would highly recommend that people start to do. So for example, historically, people would have the committee. So when we go to the committee, we just give feedback to the committee, and it's, almost everybody sitting there just kind of looking at you. But there's no actual monitoring in terms of, are we getting closer to our targets? If we're not getting closer to our targets, what is happening? Holding line managers accountable for things like recruitment. So, in recruitment practices, are they told what they're supposed to be looking for? Do they understand? Do they understand that from a hierarchy perspective, if we're employing a person in this particular position, what does that actually look like? So we've lost an African female. What is the thing that we need to be looking at? So do we need another African female, or based on the structure of the organization, do we now need a colored female, or do we need an African male? And so in terms of these changes and what is possibly going to be expected in 5 years' time, is what do we as business need to start doing? Okay, so I'm going to move the slide forward. I just want to make sure it has actually moved forward and everybody can see it. Okay, so what we're going to be doing is I'm going to be providing guidance in terms of the latest amendments, and talking about the key changes to designated employers. Just to be clear, obviously the one big change was anybody who was less than 50 is no longer required to submit. The one issue is the concern around deregistration. I'm not going to be going very broadly into that. I'm not going to be going into it very much today, but just to say in terms of deregistration. So if you are under 50 or you have maybe a sister company that is under 50, don't deregister because the system now will allow you to apply for your compliance certificate. So that is the portal. You won't have to submit. You won't have to do any of the things relating to equity, but you can still apply for the certificates. I'm going to be going through sector targets, not per industry, and the timelines, and then the expectations that are really coming, out of it from Department of Labor to you as the employer. Okay. So what are the key changes? So as everybody I think is aware, the numerical targets are now legally binding. Okay, just to make clear, because it was an issue before they came into effect, is that the sector targets, which I'll go through now, are not meant to add up to 100. So what they're in essence doing is saying to you, historically, we gave you the EAP, the economically active population, in the hopes that what you would try and do is to try and get to that point. Now what they've done is they've given you a smaller target to reach. So for example, I'm actually just going to shoot ahead on a slide. So for example, in here you will see that, top management in the wholesale sector, my slide is very small, but let's say I think it's 35% or 36%. So what they're saying there is that within top management by 2030 is what we want you to do is to have 36% or whatever it is of top management to be designated individuals, which in males will be African, Indian, and colored. The rest of the 70 odd or 60%, you can do what you like with. But the intention is that they're going to give you bite-sized chunks within the top 4 levels, is to say, okay, in 5 years, we want you to try and achieve the 36 or 35%. Okay. You'll notice that within females, remembering that over here, so if you look at females or over there, is what they're wanting is representation in top management to be I think it's 16%. So they're saying, and then you've got the remainder, which is your 50%, you can do what you like with. So you can have foreign nationals, you can have white males, it doesn't really matter, but they want you to try and achieve a minimum of that in terms of top management and senior management. And so we go down. So it's not meant to add up to 100. They also then have this element of disability down here. So they also would like you to, in 5 years, is to try and achieve that as a particular target. So the idea is, from what they're saying, is that they're going to give you the 5-year target to try and achieve that within the 5 years. And then I assume next 5 years, they will then give you a different target to achieve. The ultimate goal, however, is that they're always wanting you to try and move towards achieving EAP anyway. So they haven't replaced EAP. What they've done is said, here we go, here's bite-sized chunks. So if, as an example, and they're very clear about it, if you've already reached your target in that particular area, what you would then do is your next goal would be EAP. Remembering that within top management, okay, so what you've got to be careful of doing is in top management, the males is 36 or whatever it is percentage. What you need to try and do is divide that percentage by the EAP. So you can't necessarily, although it's not really questioned, but you need to divide that and go, of my 36%, 80%, I think that's, or whatever it is, so 80% that needs to be African male, 5%, and don't quote me on these numbers, needs to be colored male. And so you must divide that percentage by the EAP anyway to ensure that you're still moving towards the ultimate goal of the EAP. Okay, I'm just going to go back to my previous slide. Guys, as I said before, if you have a question, please pop it in the chat. I'm happy to answer that. All right, so in terms of your employment equity plans, everyone now must run from 1st of September 25 to the 31st of August 2030. Okay, so it is a 5-year plan. There were some questions at the roadshow that said, if my financial year runs from April to March, can I please use that one? The answer is no. The entire country, everybody that has an employment equity plan and is now designated, will now have a plan that runs from September. So you'll have an annual plan, but it'll run September to August. Every single company, you don't get an option. If you become designated later down the line, or you have another company that is now designated, you'll just slot into that. So your new plan might be, I don't know, 1st of September 27 to 2030. And that is basically how it will work. If you have a current plan that goes after September 2025, that plan will then almost become null and void, and your new plan will now take effect. The one question that was asked, which is, in terms of your current plans, so some organizations will have a plan that has expired in February of this year, or it could expire in July. The answer from Department of Labor is in terms of, do we have to have another plan? Because the legislation still says you cannot have a time where there isn't a current plan in place, is you still need to have a plan. So if your plan expired in February, you need to have another plan which runs from March to end of August. We have posed the question to Department of Labor and are still waiting for an answer, is to say, firstly, the legislation says that a plan must be annual, so you need to have at least 12 months, which doesn't then tie in with a 6-month or a 3-month plan. Can we, from an employment equity committee perspective, have a resolution that possibly extends our plan, so the one that's about to expire, to the end of August? We're waiting for a response, but just a note to say that if you have a current plan that is expired or about to expire before this time frame, just bear in mind that they are still doing audits, they are still checking compliance, and so you need to just be aware that you need to put something in place, whether it be a resolution, and that's what you decide to do, to extend the plan to the end of August, then you need to do that. If you have a temporary plan that's going to run for 3 months, then you need to do that as well. My sense is to say possibly, and again, I want to be clear that this hasn't been confirmed by Department of Labor, but is having a resolution from a committee perspective to extend the plan might be better, because putting a whole new plan in place for possibly 3 months, you've got to consult, you've got to do the analysis, just seems counterproductive because you're actually working on the next plan. Okay. All right, moving on then to the annual targets. So remember that when we look at it, when we do our sector targets, what's going to happen is that by August 2030, these sector targets that they've put in place is what your target is. So you no longer get to decide that you would like to get to 30% or 20% or whatever it is per level. This is now your target. So whatever industry, excuse me, whatever, thanks, there's a question there on the EAP, I'll get to that now. Whatever the target is that is listed in here will be what will be on your plan. So in terms of the updated plan, it asks in top management, what is your target? You select your industry, and that is now your target. You don't get to decide. For the bottom 2 levels, which is semi-skilled and unskilled, you will use the EAP. There is a question in terms of, will they update the EAP? They've already done that. So they, probably about 3 or 4 weeks ago, they sent an email to all designated employers, or those that I assume are on their system, which in that document, they had the sector targets and they had the EAP that they are using. So that has been distributed already. So the only change that will happen on an annual basis is so they will update EAP through the years, but your target will be set now. Okay, so in terms of your plan, it's easier in a sense because your target will be whatever it is over here. And then in terms of your EAP, that will now be your target for the bottom 2 levels. You still need to, if you haven't received communication, just pop me an email. I've got the documentation already. I'm happy to email it to you. It's just the updated forms and that kind of thing with the updated sector targets. Okay, so in terms of your targets, that's what you will put in. So in a sense, it's easier because they've already decided what your targets are. Where it becomes a little bit more complicated is what you now need to do is to say, well, that is the target. I don't get to change it. How do I now go year on year to try and make sure that I achieve that? So as an example, what you would need to do, let's say for argument's sake, you've got to get 30% in top management. What is 30% of my projected, head count in 5 years' time? And so let's assume for the purpose of this conversation, 30% is 10 people. And so you only have one person in the designated groups. How am I going to try and get there year on year on year? Remembering that now in the reports and when you are reporting to Department of Labour on an annual basis, you will now need to report. So for this year, which is now year 0, you won't need to do, an analysis in terms of have we reached our targets. But when we do the submission this year, we will now have to say, what is my target for 2026? When we get to 2026, they will compare what did you say you were going to do from a numbers perspective and what did you do? And you will now have to justify why, and I'll get to the justification. So every year we are now saying they're going to do a comparison of what we said we were going to do, which is slightly different from what they did before, because what they did before is you didn't have to put in, the targets for every single year. And they didn't actually within the report say, okay, well, did you get there or didn't you get there? So there was an ability almost to manipulate it a little bit. But now you're going to have to do that. Okay, if you deviate, and the deviation is quite important because now they're asking for justifications on deviations of the plan. So there's a number of different things which I'll go through, but you need to now justify any kind of deviations because when we submit the reports on an annual basis, they are going to ask the question, which let's say you said you were going to have 10 people, you actually only have 5. Why did you not achieve that target? What happened? And I'll go through the deviations just now. But what is going to happen is they're going to say, why did you have this deviation? Why did you not achieve the target? What happened? And you're going to put your answers in. At the end of the submission, you have the ability to apply for the compliance certificate, which I have spoken about before. So you apply for the compliance certificate, which is used if you work with government. I suspect, as I've said time and time again, is that it could possibly be used within BEE. So now we have you have to do your acknowledgements of submission. So that gets sent to your BEE consultants who will then give you the relevant points. I suspect that it might change where they won't use the acknowledgements of submission anymore. They will now say, please give me your compliance certificate in order to qualify. If so within the compliance certificate, obviously with the compliance certificate, there is the CCMA issue on the minimum wage and the harassment, but let's assume that's all fine. If you have declared something within the reporting, if an audit is done, they are going to come in and say, you said you deviated because of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They are now going to ask you to justify why you said that, which means you're going to have to bring out, I'm calling them a deviation form, but why you said this, show me the evidence of why you said this. Now, historically, in most organizations that I've worked with, if we don't reach our target, we just go, oh, well, recruitment was bad, or nobody applied for the position, or, there just weren't skills available. That's not going to really cut it any longer. So I'll talk about, some of the strategic things, but I would highly recommend that this now be monitored. So it has to be something when you're doing recruitment, for argument's sake, do the people who are doing recruitment know what your ideal candidate should look like? So not just in terms of skills, experience, etc., but in terms of trying to reach your target, what is it? And remember that changes. So as, from a headcount perspective, as you move through, it's constantly changing changing, as people come and go, your demographics within the organization change. So yes, your target is to get to 30%, but if you got 10 people versus if you've got 100, that 30% changes. So you cannot just go, I need, for argument's sake, say 2 African male, because if you got 2 African male on 10 people, and you get those 2 African male, if you now have head count of 20, 2 African male is no longer enough. You now need to change what your target is in order you've got to go, okay, well, 2's not enough. So when you're looking at recruitment, when you're going in terms of a monthly sort of, okay, we've had these people leave, you need to be looking at your workforce to go, what does it actually look like in reality? It cannot be an every 3-month thing, which is what has happened in the past. So we come to our equity committee, we've done a whole lot of recruitment, it's all happened, we look at our numbers and we go, oh no, we haven't met the target, but it hasn't actually translated into excuse me, an operational thing. So when you have your recruitment managers, when you have your line managers, when they're doing recruitment, and again, I'm not suggesting that you only pick a candidate based on race or gender, but in terms of your job spec, there's a job spec and there is something that says, one of the aspects is based on our sector targets, is the ideal candidate, if we can get one, would be, for argument's sake, an African female. If you can't get an African female, then that manager, and I'm jumping ahead a couple of slides, but that manager then needs to state, why did they not pick an African female? And that could be that there was nobody with enough skill, nobody applied for the position. I don't know, whatever. The ideal candidate was actually a white male. And then what needs to happen is to say, well, within our recruitment, these are the ideal candidates. Let's say it's firstly female, and first prize would be an Indian female, second prize is a colored female, and what shouldn't we, so almost the red zone, should we not be recruiting? Because if we continue to recruit there, we're exacerbating the problem. So if you go to, depending on your organization, if you're overrepresented, let's say in colored females, if you continue to recruit colored females, then we're saying to the line manager, we don't need any more of that. So why are you not doing something else? And the line manager then needs, or recruit manager, or whoever it is, needs to justify their particular actions. Okay. All right, so I've spoken about all of those things. Okay, so in terms of the sorry, I just need to make it a little bit bigger. So in terms of, what we need to do now, so in going forward, I would highly recommend that you, if you haven't started already, is you start looking at putting in your new plan. That is a little bit more complicated than it was before, because as I said, you're almost going to start at the end and work your way back. So having a look, so we're going to conduct a workforce analysis, but you also need to decide, so you're going to do your analysis now to see what it is that you're looking at, and then decide what is it going to look like in 5 years. Remembering there's a set target, so you say, we're doing things now where we're looking at retention and turnover. What do we predict our head count is going to be in 5 years based on our turnover and retention for the last 5 years? And then we make a more scientific assessment of where do we think we're going to go. Then we agree on that head count, the structure of the organization, how many people do we think we will have in top management, what do we think is going to happen in senior management. And granted, it's a guess, but now it's a little bit more scientific in terms of that guess, as opposed to how it was in the past. If we put 300 in the past, well, if we didn't get there, we didn't get there, and so we just plonked numbers in to say that's what we think we'll get to. Now, I would suggest that you actually need to, do a little bit more homework, looking back, looking forward, because if it's challenged at any point, if you get to the end of 5 years and you're now called to account, or even during the plan, you now have information that you can say, well, this is the basis on which I put my plan together. I had a look at my turnover, I had a look at my retention. I've gone back 5 years to see what is it that we expect is going to happen. So I've done that analysis. So not just how many of everybody do we have, and I've actually now, put something in place to say, I reasonably think we are going to have a head count of X based on the following. And then you put in your sector targets, and you see, well, what does that look like from a head count perspective? So if I think I'm going to have 25 people in a particular level, broken down in terms of firstly sector target and secondly EAP, what does that look like? So that is the first part of it. So you need to start to do that before you even meet with the committee. And then what you need to do is to obviously do your analysis. It is a little bit more, I'm going to say complex now, just because, we've got the analysis, which is very similar to what it was before, but they now ask for both an actual number as well as a percentage. And then in terms of the plan, you now have to do that per year, given the sector targets. You would need to no, the time frame is, oh, sorry, hang on, that's actually wrong. So please don't look at that. The time frame is actually, sorry, it's September to August, not, please ignore that. That's not correct. It's not October to September. Okay. So part of that, in terms of doing your employment equity plan, I would suggest is that you actually look at it from a management level to go, in addition to the plan, we now have this plan that we're possibly going to agree with. We've now got the committee. What does this mean? So outside of the committee is you now have people who are going to be looking at how do we manage recruitment? How are we going to translate this information into a day-to-day sort of thing? We can't be doing, having a meeting with the committee 3 months after the fact, and there's been a whole lot of stuff that has happened. There's been promotions, there's been terminations, there's been movement within that. What does that actually look like? You need to be having that information. So at the end of every month, I would suggest that there needs to be an analysis. What does this look like? So the people that have left, how has this, excuse me, impacted what my analysis looks like? Am I now further away from where I needed to be? When we're going to replace those people, who do I need to be replacing it with? So it's no longer going, oh, well, actually, I need 5 of, I don't know, African females. If you've now lost a whole group, you may no longer need those 5 females because the numbers have changed. So now you might need something else. And so it's an animal that continues to move within the business. It's not after the fact, oh, okay, cool, we've got to submit our employment equity. Let's quickly have a look and see how we did. This needs to be forward thinking. Okay, so if you haven't started, I would highly recommend doing that. And when you're looking at the analysis, is to have a look at, a number of things. Don't just look at the analysis and kind of go, okay, well, what do we need to do? I would suggest that it's bigger than that. And just bear in mind that even with the equity committee, a lot of people get confused and think that the equity committee are the people who should be managing and monitoring things like recruitment and promotion. The equity committee is not supposed to do that. That could be your line managers. The line managers from an operational perspective need to have the information and they need to be able to take it forward. The equity committee is there to help you monitor and see what is actually happening. You need to be feeding back to the committee, but their role is not to sit in every recruitment meeting or to decide on who's going to be promoted and who's not going to be promoted. Their job is very different to the people who are on the ground managing things. As HR, if you have HR, you should be sharing information on a monthly basis to say, this is what you're actually supposed to be looking at. So when we now go to recruitment within your job spec, that's what you should be doing. So as an example, this is something, that we do, which we share on a monthly basis, as we say, well, what does it look like? It does say, March 2025. But on a monthly basis, we almost have a look at it and go, well, what does our current workforce actually look like? Okay, in comparison to our target. So, where do we need to go by 2030? So you can see here, these numbers are not actual, but you can actually see over here, we've got 37%. And if you remember, as I said before, you've got the 37%, which is African colored and Indian, but how does that translate into when we take our EAP? How does that divide into an actual number? So if we take the 37%, what does that look like? Now in here you can see, based on a current head count, we've got, the actual is 45. Based on all of these numbers, how much are we over or under? So you can see here we've actually got, based on the number of 238, how many African males should we have in order to reach our sector target? Now, and then you can see over here, it's we've got minus 11. We need 11 colored males. We need, I think it says 35 or 34, and so we go. So you're able to now have a look at it and go, what should we be doing? And then when people are doing recruitment, is they can go, when I look at this particular position, you don't necessarily need to share this, but if I have a position that's come available, I now can say, for example, my first priority would be in this particular position would actually be an African female, because they are the most underrepresented, because I've got a current head count as at the end of whatever month it is. We now know people have left, come, gone, transferred in, transferred out. What does my head count look like in terms of a physical representation? And so who do I need as a first prize? And so when people are recruiting or promoting, whatever it may be, we say number one would be African female, second in line would be African male, and then we've got Indian male, and so we go. And that's really what you would need to look at, is to go, where do we need to go? So as an example over here, the person not to be picking when we're doing recruitment because they are overrepresented would be, for example, white male. But it could be, depending on where it is, you might have particular levels where African male is overrepresented, and you actually need to start looking at African female. But this is giving information to people, so when they're recruiting and they have a number of CVs there, they're able to make informed choices. And again, it might be promotion, a number of different things. But when you're looking for 2030, you go, well, how many people do I need to have? And you may decide to do things like put plans in place to start doing succession planning. Who would I like to train so that ideally I can get that person from 2025 to 2030 into a role I can start to promote. I can take from the levels at the bottom and start to move people up. So it's not always about recruitment, and taking into account that obviously within certain sectors, there's not enough people depending on where you are. So you can look at different strategies in terms of saying, I'm at point A, I need to get to point, well, it would be E now. How am I going to do that? What strategies am I going to be putting in place to say, how do I move from one point to the other? And so, the thought pattern in terms of dealing with this is now no longer just a after the fact, which is what we've always done, is now actually managing it going forward. Okay, so these are the kinds of things that you could then put in place to say, where do we want to go? Sorry, and just to be clear, I haven't put it in the slide, but when you're looking at doing your projection and your plan, is just remember, if we've got our sector target over here, okay, and let's assume the sector target based on a number of 100 says that based on the minimum, which let's say is 45%, on 100 we need 45 people in African males. Let's assume we have that. Are we good? Are we not good? If you already have 50 males, African males in that position, then your next target is actually EAP. So you wouldn't, don't get lost in going, well, my target actually based on 100 is 45. I've got 50 African males. So if they leave, I'm not going to replace them, because your next thing is actually saying, well, I've met my sector target. Now I'm actually moving to EAP. So just just remember that there's actually the two things that you need to be looking at. But if you've already got 50 males in there and you needed 45, maybe the focus then is on the other sections. But just, yeah, just don't get lost in it saying, well, actually, you know, if they leave, I don't have to worry about that, because you've got to go to the next level as well. So it's a two-prong approach. Okay. Alrighty, so practical, so some practical steps in terms of implementation. So firstly, you know, you need to make sure that you qualify. You need to look at your sector targets. In terms of sector targets, those of you who've actually done submissions, like physically gone in and done the submissions, you would have noticed for the last couple of years that they've actually been asking for the sectors. So it's happened anyway, and whatever sector you've put onto the form historically will be the sector that you are now. So you can't just change the sector based on, you know, which one looks better, because we've actually been submitting it for the last couple of years. Then what you need to do is you now need to look at your employment equity plan. One of the things that they did say is you have the ability, so if you have, you know, a group of companies, you do have the ability to submit as one. Just understanding that if we're going to submit as one, we submit one company to Department of Labor. There is still a requirement that each of those companies will have their own plans. So you don't get away from going, well, we have 5 companies, we're going to do one particular submission. You do one submission, but you still need to have individual plans for all of those companies. So you're not going to get away from doing that. So you just need to be aware that you can't get around it from that perspective. Okay. In terms of the deviations, as I've said already, what you need to do is, you know, the main thing is making sure, I would suggest creating a deviations document, which, you know, not that we all want forms for days and, you know, more things to complete, but when we do recruitment, promotions, etc., if we don't pick the person that is the number one, and I would suggest going, your first prize would be, I don't know, going back over here, your first prize would be this one, your second prize would be that one, and your third would be, you know, whatever it is, or actually we only need these people. If you get to the point that the position, so the person to be selected doesn't fall within that group, the line manager or whoever is dealing with it must complete a deviations form. They need to justify, we'll go through the list now, why they haven't picked the person that is your highest priority. Okay. And I do know within some organizations that if in an instance where you are selecting a person that is currently within an overrepresented group, so you know, if you have too many, I don't know, white females, remembering that a white female is in the designated groups as well. So when we're looking at this over here, the 38% is white females are included. Okay. But let's assume they're overrepresented for the purpose of this conversation. When I do my recruitment and I now go and pick a white female and they're already in an overrepresented group, that almost needs to be signed off by a senior manager. So before the person is offered the position, because it is in an overrepresented group, i.e. don't go there, you're not supposed to employ people because you're exacerbating the problem. Before anything is signed off, it must go to you know, a senior manager or the equity manager or whoever it is to say, these are my justifications, not necessarily why I'm not picking, you know, the priority 1 or 2 or 3, but why I'm picking someone who's actually going to make our problem worse. That then gets signed off because you then now have the ability to say, okay, I agree with your assessment, I agree with whatever you're saying. So for example, if it's a very scarce skill, we desperately need this particular skill, there isn't anyone else available, and so I am happy to make this decision to now employ someone who is in a group that's overrepresented. Okay, so those are the kinds of things that when we get to audits, when they start to ask you and say, I don't understand why you continue to employ people in a group that is already overrepresented. Why are you doing that? We're able to pull out our information and say, well, this is why. So we've gone through a process. We've asked the questions. These were the selected people that we wanted. You know, not necessarily having CVs for days, but saying we shortlisted 5 people. We had, I don't know, 20 applications come in. This is why we did what we did. We've interviewed 5. This is the only person. Or we actually had no CVs, so we actually had to headhunt someone, for argument's sake. And so those are things that you would put in a file, called a deviation file, where it's actually justified now and not dealt with, at the end of the year to go, I don't know why we didn't get there. Can anyone remember? So the structure needs to be different. Okay. Then prepare for your compliance certificate. As I've said before, I know a lot of organizations are going, oh, we don't work with states. It's not really an issue for us. There's nothing in writing, nothing's been confirmed, but it makes logical sense that at some point the compliance certificate will be used probably within BE, and it'll be the document that they say, please, can you give us this document so that we can give you your points for employment equity. It hasn't come into play yet, but it makes sense that it would. So don't sort of go, I don't need the certificate for anything, because if you're working with large corporates, if you're working with states, it just makes sense that it might become something that is part of the business. So when you look at the compliance certificates, one, you need to submit the reports on time. So just from a timing perspective, the online system opens the same as it has before, which will be the 15th of September to the 15th of January. Nothing changes from that perspective. Excuse me. But you have an ability now to say, once you've submitted, you can then apply for your certificate. You would ordinarily get your certificate, so you will go on and you will say, no, I have no CCMA cases for harassment, and no, I have no CCMA cases, or bargaining council, whichever one, for not paying minimum wage, and everything is fine with my employment equity. You then make the application for the certificate, and you will get it almost in good faith. If an audit then happens later and they say, okay, well, you said the following things, please give me your proof. The inspector can then say, oh, hang on, I don't agree with you. You have no evidence of this. You have no evidence of that, and so they can then retract that certificate. So you will get it anyway, but you're making a statement. So it's almost like the certificate of good standing, for argument's sake. So you will get the certificate, which may be withdrawn at a later stage. Okay. I know that there was a question. I'll get to it just now. And then, as I said, you obviously engage the stakeholders. If you've got unions, etc., you would do that. But again, reiterating the point, I would highly recommend, and if that you change the way that you engage with equity. It's now a strategic thing. And I know people are terrified that they're going to, we're going to have to fire a whole lot of people, which has never been the case. Okay. We've never been required to, fire people for affirmative action. And I'll actually go into the code just now. But it needs to be a more strategic thing. So when we're recruiting people, when we're promoting, when we're looking at training, those kinds of things. So decide who you're going to be talking to and actually start to engage with people so that you can actively work towards moving to the next level. And if you have an actual issue, so you're sitting there and you're going, why are we not finding people within this particular group? And as management, you're not leaving it up to the committee to go, what's happening. You're actually aware of what the challenges are. So it could be that where you are situated, you've maybe moved premises and you've now moved, I don't know, wherever it is, and nobody can get there. So unless they have a vehicle, there's no public transport, for argument's sake. And so now you have a very real challenge because people can't get to where you're going. Or maybe there's no skill, but it's not just a box ticking exercise. You're able to then go, okay, well, hang on, we don't have skill in this particular industry or this particular job. How do we go about changing that? And now you start to look and go, well, hang on, can we maybe start to do training? So we take people from the lower levels and we maybe engage in training with the hopes that in 5 years we can start to promote people. So we instead of looking outside, maybe we look inside. So there's a number of different things, but from a strategic level, you're not just doing numbers, you're actually looking at how you make this particular change. Okay. So this is the when we talk about the reasons for deviations. So well, you may or may not recall, but there was an agreement between so there was a thing a while ago with Department of Labor where they were challenged in terms of the amendments that were coming in, and so there was a CCMA agreement which basically said, one, you cannot fire people as a result of affirmative action. So it's not a fair labor practice. It's actually discrimination. So that's always been a case. It's just now been put in writing. And then you've also now got here in terms of what are the reasons why we might not reach our particular goals. Okay, this has always been in the Employment Equity Act. Okay, it's always been there. It's just now put in a different format. But if you've read the act before, as I said, I've been doing this for a very, very long time. These have always been there as reasons why we haven't been able to reach it. Just be mindful though, is that saying things like, oh, well, nobody had, we didn't get people who were suitably qualified, is not acceptable. Saying, oh, well, nobody in the right group applied for the position. The expectation is that you're going to be asking more questions than that. So if you're getting a number of people that have applied for a job, and let's assume you need a white female, but you don't have anybody there that quite matches your requirements, the questions are then to say, well, could we then take this person and maybe give them a little bit of leeway and train them up? If you can't, well, that's fine, but you can't just use the, oh, well, there were no suitably qualified persons. The questions that are going to be asked, which again come from your deviations, is to go, okay, well, what are we doing here? So I want to see what it is that you've done. You can't just use it as an excuse. So there are 7 reasons for deviations. Okay, and these are them here. So sorry, just to go back again. So the things that you need to consider when putting in your plan is looking at all of these things over here. But as I say, these have always been in place. Okay, so there is a code of good practice. And again, this has been in place for quite some time in terms of preparing, implementing, and monitoring an EE plan. So that's always been there. But and it's not, we've been doing the turnover and the attrition and the retention, whatever. I would highly recommend that you look at that. If you need assistance with doing the plan, please let us know. But actually looking at what is your rates of turnover? What has it been for the last 5 years, and projecting it forward? What is your attrition rate? Do you have people that are going to be retiring? What is your retention rate? So how many people are staying, etc., etc. Now, when we look at the justifiable reasons as to why you didn't reach your targets, these are the reasons. Now, when we submit our report, not this year, when we do the report in 2026, as I said before, you will now submit your report this year, and you will now say, what is your target for 2026? That target will include both a physical number, so your head count, as well as a percentage. So if we have 100 people, what does that look like from a percentage perspective? And so when we look at it next year, if now we have 120, the numbers might be off, but the percentages might be right. And so if we've deviated, they are going to ask you, sorry, what are the reasons for your deviation? And these are the things that they have given based on that CCMA agreement that could be reasons as to why you haven't achieved. So it's insufficient recruitment opportunities, promotion, the skills and experience. There was a CCMA award, i.e. possibly someone was terminated and has now come back. So you lost someone, they've maybe come back. Transfer of business, mergers and acquisitions. Remembering that if you're going to do, let's assume it's a Section 197 transfer, so you take over a business, you take them over as they are. So all of a sudden, maybe now your business looks very different, and there's a whole lot of people that kind of are now overrepresented. That could be one of the reasons. And then business economics. So in that situation, again, you now need to have justifications as to why whatever happened, and keep your file there as to, not deciding, if you're ever audited, you now have the file, and I would highly recommend that it is done on a monthly basis. If you all of a sudden have an audit and they're asking you, remembering that with audits, not this year, they can go back 3 years. So they can now, so if we're in 2027 or 2028 and they say, well, hang on a second, I now want to have a look at what you've done since 2025, you're not going to know what has happened. So I would highly recommend, and again, I don't think that this sits with the equity committee. Okay, that's not their job. This would fit within HR, but you have a file in which you're able to go through and say, well, this is actually what's happened for the last 3 years. And so you're able to look at that and provide them with the information that they need there and then. Okay. I think I have already said this, but yes, so I'm going to go past. Look at the file, keep the deviation process, also decide what is that deviation process. So what are you going to do when a manager, so who is going to be, I would also suggest you do training for anybody who's doing recruitment, promotion, whatever, in terms of what your expectation is, and then have a process in place that says, how do we roll this out? If this happens, what does the line manager need to do? So who gets to decide when we're doing recruitment, who's doing what here? Okay. Alrighty, so I've spoken very fast. Okay, so these are some of the strategic implementation priorities that I would have a look at. And again, I'm going to say it's very important that you look at this from a strategic level. I'm not overly concerned that all of a sudden all businesses are going to be closed and they're going to force you to recruit X, Y, and Z. These things should have been in place anyway. And if you're wanting to effectively manage equity, it has to be strategic. Okay. So when you're looking at your workforce planning, I've said these things already, it needs to be a monthly thing. I would even be, depending on the size of the business, but if you're a large business that has a lot of turnover of staff, people coming and going, I would do it monthly. If your business is slightly smaller, then you can look at every 3 months, but you need to be having, so if your turnover is not that, you don't have a lot of movement, but you need to be able to give information to people who are doing the changes, who are recruiting people, who are looking at things. Okay. I would also conduct regular internal audits. So having a look at things like, what does your files look like? Obviously your meetings every 4 months at the very least. Having a look at what do your minutes look like for your meetings. Is your committee still relevant, based on your latest analysis? Is it still relevant in terms of what you're doing? Does your committee now understand what it is that we're doing? Or do they just all sit there and look at you when you talk? Do they actually understand what is the expectation? How do the sector targets affect us? Do they know what is going on? Lots of people are not going to like this one, but I 100% would put equity into, anybody who is going to be, maybe not every manager, but anybody who has the ability to impact equity. So promotions, recruitment, even training for that matter. Not necessarily who do we pick for training, but it's to say, how does training impact our long-term goal? So all of those things need to be in, part of the line manager, or whatever the right terminology, it has to be part of their KPIs. They need to be held accountable to going, what does your equity look like within your division, department, whatever? What have you done? Why do you keep going backwards? This cannot just be one person's responsibility who sits at the top and is desperately trying to get people to make the change. It needs to be, ground level, if that makes sense. I would also, like I've said about the committee, I would also then start to engage. This has to be, almost executive senior managers need to be driving this thing forward. It cannot be, oh, cool, we're having an equity meeting. I'll try and squeeze 5 minutes in. If you're going to make this thing work, it has to be done at that level. Develop talent pipelines and succession plans, which I said already. And again, I'm a big believer of this, is not everything needs to be recruiting people in, but having a long-term view of saying, how do we manage this? How do we get people from here to there in 5 years? What is our plan? And again, it can take 5 years, but we've got young people who possibly, if we use our CETA correctly, if we are getting money from the CETAs, if we're doing internal training, if we're managing those people, we now have a pool of candidates that we have the ability to pick from if we want to do promotions, etc. The deviations, as I've said, I would prepare a document in which people need to justify. And then the main thing is driving accountability through management forums. This needs to be something that we're now calling people to account. It cannot sit with one person at the top. Okay. It cannot just sit with the poor HR manager who's supposed to make the change. Okay. All right, so just in terms, I think I've discussed this already. So just in terms of the compliance certificate, so everybody can apply for the compliance certificate. The difference with if you've got less than 50 employees, you only need to look at the minimum wage and the harassment. So if you have a case in the last 12 months against you for any harassment at CCMA, or non-compliance with minimum wage, you then don't, you're not allowed to get, well, you're not eligible for the certificate. But other than that, you should be fine. I'm really sorry, that's a duplicate slide. Okay. So just in terms of, as we 4 minutes out, and I'll get to the questions now. So if you're needing assistance in terms of taking this thing forward, we're very happy to assist. We can help with monthly or quarterly strategy meetings. So that's in addition to the equity committee. As I've said, the equity committee is not the people who drive this thing forward. There are managers or management in the equity committee that kind of have a look at this, but the equity committee is not the people who sit in the recruitment. They're not the people who need to decide. Remembering that the committee are people from all levels of the organization who are not necessarily skilled to be able to be making those decisions. I would then also look at, we can help you with gap analysis and deviation planning, workforce alignment. We can look at your turnover and your retention, and we can obviously help you with your I'll get to the question now. We can help you with your reporting and your submission. So there's all of those things. And remember, the plan is now 5 years. You've got a set target of what you need to. Okay, previous slide, going back, which is this one. All right, so there's the previous slide in terms of what I would suggest that you need to do. And I sound like a broken record. Equity can't, if it's going to be done correctly and not something that you're dreading, I would 100% look at doing these things. And if you don't have the internal skill, then then I would get someone external to try and help you. We cannot be experts at everything all the time, but from an executive perspective, this has to be something that you're going to look at, not just a quarterly meeting that we're now going to attend and hopefully everybody listens. It's got to be done bigger than that, and you need to be managing it from a strategic level. Okay. Okay. So I'm just going to go to the questions now. What happens to the EE targets set when the EAP changes? So in terms of your, the EAP is not going to change substantially. It changes by 1% or 2% every year. But remembering, so your first point is to get to your sector target. And that and when we look at the EAP, that's for your semi-skilled and unskilled, but you don't change the targets every year. That has to be set in stone. But you would change your monthly sort of or quarterly targets, your quarterly reports might change with the new EAP. Okay. How many management should be on an equity committee? That's going to be dependent on how big your committee is. So how I would suggest that you structure your committee is you look at your workforce, you do an analysis, and let's assume you've got 1% is top management, 2% senior management. Your committee needs to make up those people. If you have an HR person, I would suggest that the HR person is on the committee, you know, to kind of help drive things forward. But the senior manager, so you can have more than one senior manager, should be on the committee, and they then take the information and drive it forward. Just be aware though that if you're going to have a committee, let's assume you have 4 senior managers, equity senior managers, you can't have 4 equity senior managers and 1 employee. It has to be representative of your workplace. So if you're going to have 4 senior managers, then you need to ensure that everybody else is equally represented based on your workforce. But there's no specific number. I would suggest that you structure your committee based on how it's going to work for you. But remember, the person who sits in the equity meeting should be coming back to the management committee, the management forum, the exec meetings, whatever. And part of one of the agenda items in your management meetings should be the strategic level feedback from your equity senior manager in your management meetings. So it actually should be an agenda item. So your equity committee is not your management meetings. That is your equity. It has a specific agenda all on its own, and that person then feeds back at your whatever you're going to call it, your exec meeting or whatever. Alrighty. Okay, will we be able to change? No. So my understanding is, and from what I've been told, is once your targets are set in place, you cannot change them. But if you, so when your deviations are in place, if you haven't met your targets, you would then use one of these, which could be impact on business economic circumstances would be your justification for not meeting your targets. Okay, but you can't change it. Otherwise, we would be able to manipulate it. Then I got another question. When determining the head count for EE purposes, do we only include directly employed staff, or do we include staff appointed via labor broker? The staff appointed by the labor broker, they don't work for you, so they would work for, so it's whoever you can't double count. You need to, the labor broker would need to employ them and would need to report on them. Just be aware though that there is that element that if you've got somebody who's worked for you, I don't quote me on this, but I think it's 3 or 4 months, in essence, they really are your employees. So in one of the sessions that we went to, what was said was, if you're going to employ people from a labor broker, if they've been with you for a set number of time, and I want to say it's like, 3 or 4 months, it might be 4 months, in essence, you should be reporting on them, because otherwise you have the ability to manipulate the system. So if you're going to get people from a labor broker, make a decision in terms of where you're going to. Is the labor broker going to report on them or you? Then you need to decide that. I do want to say something talking about the labor broker, and we still have this query regarding temporary staff. The legislation has not changed. It has always been like this. Okay. Is temporary staff, for the definition of employment equity, is a temporary employee is somebody who has been contracted to work for you for less than 3 months. So if their contract is less than 3 months, they are deemed to be a temporary employee. Any contract that is longer than 3 months, you must now put them under permanent. Okay, so the fact that I might have a 12-month contract with you, so technically I'm a temporary employee, you have to report them under permanent staff. Okay, and it's not somebody, so if I do 3 months, 3 months, 3 months, 3 months, 3 months, they are still permanent staff, and so you must report them under permanent. Okay, so please be aware that there's that element. You also can't not report if they go through your payroll. If they're there, unless they've worked for less than 24 hours, they must be on your equity report. Okay, the movement. Oh, hang on. Okay, so the slide there on the movement and the shortfall. is there. So this is a document that we've prepared. If we've had a number of people asking how they get to use all the stuff that we've got, please feel free to email us, and we can obviously, this is something that we prepared. It's an interactive document that you can put your information in, and it shows you what you need to do. There's the slide over there. We've also got other things that we can do, turnover and retention, looking at your plan going forward. And so, yes, just email us. You can email info@hrtalk.co.za, and we're very happy to engage with you from that perspective. Okay. The recorded webinar will be up on our YouTube channel. It normally takes a couple of days, but it will be on our YouTube channel as soon as it's ready, and you can view it then. Okay, going on to the next question. As per the headcount question, what about the staff temporarily employed? I think, sorry, I didn't see that question. So anybody, again, so in terms of headcount, I know within the projected numbers, so they have the ability to project temporary staff, which doesn't make any sense for me, because I don't know why you would, you would project temp staff. Okay, but there is a section that you can do that. But remember the definition of temp in terms of equity, it's not the same as any other definition. If the contract of employment is less than 3 months, you put them under temporary. If the contract, so even for example, if I employ someone to take over someone who has gone on maternity leave, because the contract is more than 3 months, they are now deemed to be permanent from a reporting perspective from equity. So you should really have very few people that you're actually putting under temporary. Everyone else should be under permanent if their contract of employment, so not if, I've been employed for less than 3 months, so that gets a bit confusing as well. If I have a 12-month contract, I wouldn't report under temporary for the first 3 months and then under permanent. If my contract of employment is more than 3 months, I'm now under permanent. Okay, so it should make your projections a lot easier, because you kind of know what you're going to be doing. So in terms of, I don't know who you are, but you need to change that. You must include everybody for more than 3 months. Okay. Okay, so what are my thoughts on the DA fighting the EE targets? Do you think they're going to succeed? My opinion's probably not very popular. I don't think they're going to succeed. This has been fighting for a long time. And my personal view on it is, if it's managed correctly, what the Act is not saying is that you have to fire a whole lot of people. Okay, there are sections, and there was that CCMA agreement which said, and I'm happy to share the agreement, but there was a CCMA agreement, and I want to say it was Solidarity, who's already gone to court to say, hang on, we think that this is unfair. That was probably 2 years ago, in which it was agreed, one, you can't fire people based on affirmative action, so I can't fire you because you're a white male. Okay, that is automatically unfair, and we've had the legislation already which gives you section 6.1 that says you cannot unfairly discriminate on any person based on race, gender, etc. So terminating a white male because they're a white male, excuse me, is automatically unfair anyway. And so the DA has gone to court. I personally don't think it's going to make a difference, because they're now giving you targets to say, we want you to try and achieve it. We've had now since 2000, we've had targets. We've had the EAP anyway. So they've been asking us to transform, since the year, I think it was, since 2000, they've been asking us to do that. And they're saying business is moving too slow. And having worked with equity for a long time, what happens is people use the easy excuse. Oh, I couldn't find anybody. Oh, I did my recruitment, but there was nobody suitable. But nobody's ever done it from a strategic perspective to go, is that actually the reason? It hasn't been filtered down to line managers. So when they're making the decision, they just pick the person that they think is the best, with absolutely no context in terms of what it is that we're expecting to do. So I don't think it's going to happen. I think it's still going to go ahead. And in any event, even if they do change the sector targets, I would still suggest is going at this from a strategic perspective and saying, how do we actually try and make our workforce more representative? So forget about the targets, is to say, what do we actually look like? I mean, are we representative? We try and do a whole lot of other things to go, are we being fair? Are we moving in the right direction? Just make it now a strategic thing. The second thing is, okay, I've spoken about the TES. Hang on. Okay, must we include consultant staff, a psychologist, music teacher? I assume that's coming from a school. If they're on your payroll, then yes. So even if they're being paid per lesson, or only when they work, yes, you would include them. Just remember that excuse me, that when you're doing your EA4, so your remuneration, if you've got someone who's only getting paid per hour that they work, you need to do a calculation to compare like for like, because otherwise you're going to get someone who for annual remuneration might be 3,000. And you got someone who's, I don't know, on 100,000. So you need to assume if the psychologist was working, let's say 45 hours a week in line with everybody else, and they were earning that salary, what are they working? So you just got to fix the numbers there just to make sure that it doesn't look off. Okay. The breakdown of the sector targets has already been shared. It was emailed by Department of Labour, but if you haven't received the email, then you can just email us and I'm happy to share it with you, but it was emailed by Department of Labour to any designated employer. It came about three weeks ago. Just check with your IT department that they're not blocking emails from Department of Labour, but if you don't have it, just send us an email. Okay. All right, the plan for temporary, you will have, if you have seasonal workers, for example, in agriculture, yes, so you can in that situation. It's just the main thing is, well, that's going to be quite difficult. But again, in that situation, what I would do is excuse me, I would look back in terms of what has the history said. So if you have a look at your history, you'll probably be able to kind of do a more scientific plan for going forward. Obviously, when we're looking at the plan for going forward, we're basing it on information that's in the past. It may not necessarily happen, but I would have a look I would look at your history and then plan for the future to say, this is what we've kind of done. This is what the numbers are telling us we can expect. So, and then what we can do is to say, well, based on your history, this is what it's going to look like in 5 years. Do you think that's reasonable? And you can say, oh, no, hang on a second. We actually had a really bumper season 2 years ago, but that's not the norm. And then we change the numbers accordingly. Yes, for youth. Okay, so yes, for youth. Again, if they're going through your payroll, which generally it does. Okay, well, depends actually. So if they're going through your payroll, then yes, I would include them. And in terms of the gap between the highest and lowest, it will make a huge difference, even if you've got interns and that kind of thing. So yes, it will make a bit of a difference, but I would include them anyway. Because so I know previously an audit was done in which Department of Labour went to, they had a look on, the UIF and said, for example, you're paying UIF for 500 people, but you're only reporting on, I don't know, 200. What's going on here? Why have you not included them? So my take on that, if it's going through the payroll, then you must include them, unless of course you have an actual genuine sort of independent contractor that works for you regularly and you're paying them through payroll so that the tax is dealt with by you, then I would have a justification to exclude them. But yes, for youth, I would probably include, because generally the contract with them is, for a time period. Okay. Um, Okay, so the email address, I'm going to take you to the end of the slide. There are no other questions. So if you would like more information, please feel free to email us. I hope it's on this slide here. Okay, it's not, but I'll post it in the group. So if you need any information, please email info@HR Talk, and we are more than happy to share the information with you. Okay, I've posted it in the chat. Thank you, everybody. We've gone over by 15 minutes. Thank you, everybody, for attending. Please reach out if you need help, even if it's just to put your plan together, to have a consultation, whatever it may be. But thank you for attending. I hope it was insightful. I hope it was helpful. And I hope to see you soon at the next webinar. But please feel free to reach out. Okay, I'll stay on for a few minutes if anyone else has got any other questions. And then I will log off in about 2 minutes. Thanks, everyone. Okay, I got a question. What about sports coaches who work seasonally? Um, yeah, so that has been an issue, within schools. Um, so, uh, firstly, okay, so I would try and have a look at what they, yeah, okay. So, if they are working, let's say they're rugby, so I would assume within rugby maybe it's a term. My question would be is why do they not have a contract? So if they're completely an independent contractor, so they're working with you and 15 other schools, then they wouldn't be included because they're not technically an employee. Okay. If, however, they're under your control, so that would be a question for the independent contractors thing. So are they truly an independent contractor, or are they not? So if they're an independent contractor, then definitely not. They would not be included because they're not your employee. The same as if I came to do equity for you. I'm an independent contractor for you, so you wouldn't necessarily include me. If they're on the payroll, then yeah, I would just have a look at it and say, do we believe, based on the I think it's interpretation note 17 with SARS, do we believe that they're actually an independent contractor? And like I said, they can be on payroll, because you're taking the tax off on their behalf, but they're technically not, but you wouldn't be paying UIF for them. You would only be doing it from a tax perspective. So that's how I would approach it. Hopefully that answers the question. All right, so I'm going to be logging off now. If anybody has any queries, please feel free to email info@HR Talk. I trust you will have a good Wednesday and a good upcoming week. Thank you, everybody.